A stock rush, a country trying to solve most of its problems with massive money printing, and an economic crisis on the horizon. What lessons for today are there in the dramatic end of the so-called Weimar Republic? Germany in the late 1920s gave the impression of being a relatively successful and stable democracy, but it had been simmering under the surface for some time. One black swan was all it took for the whole illusion to collapse spectacularly like a giant house of cards, with drastic repercussions for the whole world. If you want to soak up the atmosphere of this dramatic history that took place just outside the First Republic, check out the 1972 film Cabaret or the contemporary detective series Babylon Berlin. But we'd rather look at something else, how the economy worked back then and what we can take away from it for today's dramatically changing world. Interwar Germany was struggling to come to terms with the fact that fixed exchange rates and the absence of state intervention were a mere memory of the idyllic 19th century. The country was mainly burdened by the repayment of loans and war reparations. And this was perfect grist for the mill of extremists on both the right and the left of the political spectrum, so that parliamentary democracy was in fact much more fragile than it might have appeared from the outside. The first major crisis occurred in 1923, shortly after Germany missed a war reparations payment in November 1922. The previous one had exhausted all the country's reserves. This set off a chain of events from which the country was unable to recover. It all began when France and Belgium, in response to the default, occupied the Ruhr, the main German industrial area at the time. The German government had already tried to resolve the situation by, among other things, printing money on an unprecedented scale, which in the second half of 1923 led to the Germans experiencing the worst price inflation known to mankind up to that time. Marks were losing their value literally by the hour. But hyperinflation was not only a disaster, for some people it was a blessing. Debt-ridden industrialists, but also small businessmen, property owners or people with mortgages suddenly found that they were able to easily pay off their loans with virtually worthless money. If you contracted for material at today's prices in marks, but the repayment was not due until a month later, the goods were practically free for you. It was also an advantage to work for wages, because they were renegotiated every day. The main losers of hyperinflation, on the other hand, were creditors, especially those who lent money to the government, small savers and employees on fixed incomes, pensioners, students and the sick. A simple trick. Back then, the government successfully helped itself with a simple trick. On the 15th of November, it launched the so-called monetary reform by introducing a new Rentenmark, which had an exchange rate of $4.20 per mark, a sort of echo of the pre-World War I gold mark. The new currency was intended to restore confidence in the German financial system and tame hyperinflation, and it did so for a while. The problem was that the Reichsbank had no gold with which to back the new currency, the rest of which was exhausted during the occupation of the Ruhr. So land mortgages and industrial bonds were used to back the new currency. 500 annuity marks were to be exchangeable for bonds with a nominal value of 500 gold marks, i.e. annuity notes with an annual yield of 5%. In practice, however, you would have a hard time claiming them. Does this remind you of something from the present and the last great mortgage crisis? The psychological trick worked on the people. Inflation was seemingly brought under control thanks to the Germans' confidence in the new currency. But against that backdrop, massive inflation continued quietly. While only 400 trillion paper marks were still in circulation in November 1923, by July the following year it was already 1,211 trillion. The Reichsmark issued 2.4 billion Rentmarks. The illusory stability of the Rentmark, together with the influx of American loans, put the German economy back on its feet for a time. Production was modernized and German competitiveness slowly returned. At home, private consumption grew again. It didn't make much sense to save, and municipalities began to invest massively in expanding infrastructure and building new housing. But all was not so rosy. In addition to inflation, public debt was rising sharply, among other things because of the rapid growth of public sector wages. Between 1925 and 1930, Germany's national debt swelled to twice its current level. Public spending was up by 50%, while tax revenue did not grow as much. Despite the industrial recovery, the country also had a number of unemployed that slowly climbed to 4 million between 1928 and 1929. Even ordinary Germans did not have much faith in the domestic economy and invested their saved and, increasingly, borrowed money in foreign markets, especially in the American stock market miracle. So all it took was one black swan and the illusion of recovery collapsed like a house of cards. The crash on the New York Stock Exchange. This event finally happened on Tuesday, the 24th of October 1929, when the New York Stock Exchange suffered the biggest stock market crash in history after several years of steady growth. As if it were not enough that the American stock market crash ruined the lives of many German ordinary investors who lost everything, American banks began to withdraw their short-term foreign loans from the Weimar Republic. But without them, the German economy's resources dried up and the country faced the biggest economic crisis in its history. How did it happen? This is a very interesting and instructive economic moment. Hyperinflation made it virtually impossible to build up domestic reserves, and the situation escalated to the point where, by the end of 1930, half of the Reichsmark came from short-term private foreign loans. German banks were in a similar situation, 40 to 50% of their deposits being foreign capital. What happened next? The debtors very quickly found that they were unable to repay the short-term loans and the only solution was to take on more, even larger and less profitable debt. The worst off were, of course, the cities that had previously lavished foreign capital on their development. Another blow came in the form of a weakening demand for German goods abroad. Here it is important to remember that Germany was still the most important industrial state in Europe at the time, so the effects on its economy were devastating. The economic crisis shot up the prices of housing, consumer goods, and even food to astronomical heights, and factories began to cut the wages of unskilled workers because they could pass the pitchforks over job applicants. In addition, one more thing that no one had counted on had a negative impact. One of the first steps taken by the new parliamentary democracy was the creation of a very generous social insurance program against unemployment, which originally envisaged a number of unemployed not exceeding 800,000. But suddenly there were 3.7 million of them running around the streets, according to official statistics alone. And when the crisis hit its peak in 1932, the German labor authorities officially recorded 6 million people out of work. Agriculture was no better off than industry. For a change, it suffered from a rapid decline in purchasing power in the cities. Suddenly there was no money for repairs to farm buildings and other necessary investments, which led to more and more redundancies, debt and expropriation. The beginning of the end. In a last desperate attempt to prevent disaster, Reich President Paul von Hindenburg tried to create a presidential cabinet made up only of experts to solve the country's most pressing problems. The government relied solely on the president, who appointed the financial expert Heinrich Brüning as its chancellor. He immediately set about pushing through unpopular austerity measures such as controlling public spending and drawing up a balanced budget, cutting welfare benefits or increasing excise duties, but completely ignored the mood of society, which later backfired on him. Brüning's foreign policy was not very successful either. For example, the attempt to conclude a customs union with Austria resulted in the withdrawal of foreign investors' capital from both the Weimar Republic and Austria. The German public, which was most affected by the austerity measures, also lost confidence, and the run on the banks began. In 1931, the Darmstädter und Nationalbank, Germany's second-largest bank, collapsed after its largest debtor, Nordwall Concern, declared bankruptcy. To avoid a chain reaction, the government had to declare a bank holiday for 2 days and pour 250 million Reichsmarks into the system just to cover the direct financial losses. Even in this situation, Brüning insisted on a deflationary policy, which exacerbated the banking crisis caused mainly by the huge number of subprime loans and the lack of deposit insurance. This was followed by a further rise in unemployment. The end of the Weimar experiment was in sight. Virtually all layers of society opposed the continued functioning of the Republic. And what is the lesson? Too much inflation is a serious problem, but if approached correctly it can be turned into an interesting opportunity in the short term. Especially for borrowers. Markets don't usually go through the roof, and betting everything on a single card is not an investment, it is simply gambling. Also, being too long and too much dependent on short-term foreign loans is a road to hell. The current Chinese real estate sector could tell a story. And perhaps most interestingly, as the Brüning case demonstrates, defending monetary expansion at all costs, deflationary policy, is as dangerous as imaginatively throwing money out of a helicopter. Quantitative easing. Both can end in a conflagration that can no longer be stopped by the person who caused it. So some happy medium is the most sensible way forward.